everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're having a wonderful day. This is part 2 in my series about lost Victorian continents. In this video, we're going to touch a little bit again on Atlantis, but mostly we're going to be talking about the lost continents of Moo and Lemuria. So I hope you're excited, because this is a doozy. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to this channel, turn on the little bell icon so you can get notified of future uploads. Please like this video and leave a comment underneath. Also, follow me on Instagram. It's free. There's a link in the description. And also, my email is in the description in case you need to contact me for whatever reason. Now let's jump into it. Atlantis is probably the most famous lost continent in history. It's certainly the only one to have its own Disney movie. But I would venture that it's not even the most interesting lost continent in history. In my last video, I spoke of how, inspired by his travels in Mesoamerica, the Abbé de Bourbourg theorized that the Inca, Maya, and Aztec people were descended from Atlantis, and how de Bourbourg's theories inspired Ignatius Donnelly to write Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which is the book that sparked a mainstream interest in Atlantis. But Ignatius Donnelly was not the only person to be inspired by the Abbé de Bourbourg, and in this video we're going to be talking about the other people who were inspired by de Bourbourg's work. First among them was a man named Augustus le Plongeon. Inspired by the Abbé de Bourbourg, he also traveled to Mesoamerica and became one of the first people to perform an archaeological excavation on several famous Mayan temples. In the course of his excavations, he developed a theory that is, quite frankly, so absolutely cracked, it's difficult to believe that it was ever taken seriously by anybody. In short, Le Plongeon recognized some superficial similarities between ancient Egyptian culture and several Mesoamerican cultures, and this was all it took for him to invent the lost continent of Moo. M-U. Now, the name Moo was actually first used by the Abbé de Bourbourg in his translation of the Toronto Codex. Now, it is worth noting that this translation is looked upon with great suspicion by most modern scholars. Moo is sometimes called the Atlantis of the Pacific, and although the continent of Moo would eventually be placed in the Pacific Ocean, it's not actually clear quite where Le Plongeon believed Moo was located. Context clues in his writings actually point to him having it being in the Atlantic Ocean, and in fact some people think that Moo was just Atlantis by another name. Now, there's a lot of complexity and also a lot of contradiction in the canon of Moo, and detailed information is difficult to come by as Le Plongeon's books are relatively scarce, but the general gist is as follows. The main character of Le Plongeon's story is a woman called Queen Moo, M-O-O. Not M-U like the continent, but M-O-O like the noise a cow makes. Le Plongeon believed that Queen Moo was an actual historical figure, that she was a queen of the Mayan Empire, and that her life was documented in bas-reliefs and statues and paintings that he found while excavating Chichen Itza. He said that she was the eldest daughter of King Kanchi and Queen Zok of the Mayan Empire, and as far as I can tell, neither King Kanchi or Queen Zok has any basis in reality. Moo was, desired by both of her brothers, Prince Ko, also called Shak Mul, and Prince Ak. These are quite the names. She chose to marry her brother Prince Ko, who I will say again was her brother, and in retaliation, her other brother, Prince Ak, flew into a jealous rage and killed Prince Ko. On the death of her husband, whom I will remind you was also her brother, Le Plongeon said that Queen Moo fled to the land of Moo, which is described as having been a vast and mighty island empire, of which the Mayan Empire was a satellite. However, when she reached the land of Moo, Queen Moo found that it had disappeared beneath the waves. Because she could not take refuge in Moo, she carried on to Egypt. And this is why some people think that Le Plongeon actually thought that Moo was in the Atlantic and not in the Pacific, because if you're going from Mesoamerica to Egypt, it makes a lot more sense to go by way of the Atlantic Ocean than it does to go by way of the Pacific Ocean. Le Plongeon was a devoted Freemason, and he believed, incorrectly, that he'd found Masonic symbols in Mayan ruins. Therefore, it stood to reason that the great Queen Moo had access to ancient and arcane Freemasonic knowledge. And naturally, once she got to Egypt, she used this ancient and arcane Freemasonic knowledge to found the Egyptian civilization, all while staying in close contact with her Mayan homeland, using the Mayan Empire's global telegraphic network, obviously. Le Plongeon believed that the story of Queen Moo served as the basis for the story of the Egyptian deities Isis and Osiris. It's true there are some superficial similarities between the two stories. Both Moo and Isis married their brothers, and both brother husbands were murdered. But beyond those similarities, there's actually not very much in common between the two stories, unless there is more of the Moo story elsewhere that I was not able to find that ties it more into the Isis and Osiris legend. But Le Plongeon was not finished. He shored up this story with some rather questionable evidence. For example, Queen Moo's name is taken from the Mayan word for macaw. Therefore, Le Plongeon believed that Queen Moo was represented by the parrot pictogram. Le Plongeon connected this to Isis because she is usually portrayed as a winged figure. That is a very, very tenuous connection by any standard. Shakmul, the name of Queen Moo's husband, is the Mayan word for jaguar paw. So naturally that means that Queen Moo had the Great Sphinx of Giza erected to honor her dead husband. Speaking of which, did you know that there's a theory that this Great Sphinx of Giza began its life as an ordinary lion statue, or maybe as a jackal? We're used to seeing images of the Great Sphinx taken from head on, from which place it looks relatively proportional. But if you look at images of it taken from the side, you can see that the head is quite diminutive in comparison to the rest of the statue. This has led some Egyptologists to speculate that the current head was made by carving down the original head of the statue. Now, so far Le Plongeon's theory is strange, but buckle up because it's about to get a whole lot stranger. You see, while he was performing excavations at Chichen Itza, Le Plongeon noticed that some of the figures bore a resemblance to him, and some of the other figures bore a resemblance to his wife, Alice. That could only mean that, obviously, Queen Moo and her husband, Shakmul, had both reincarnated thousands of times over the centuries, and that their current incarnations were Le Plongeon and his wife. Both Le Plongeon and Alice wrote multiple books about their past lives. Now, these theories were accepted by Madame Blavatsky and her Theosophical Society, but the rest of the world seems to have thought that this was all completely ridiculous and insane, which it is, by the way, if you didn't need me to tell you that. After Le Plongeon's death in 1908, his widow, Alice, took all of his Moo papers and gave them to a man named James Churchward, who somehow managed to make the whole thing even weirder. I would not have guessed that was possible, but here we are. Between 1926 and 1933, Churchward published 4 books about Moo. He claimed that when he was a soldier in India in the 1870s, he had seen some ancient clay tablets that had come from the land where man first emerged. Moo. The tablets contained a history of how the earth, the land of Moo, and the superior beings who inhabited Moo, called the Nakal, were created by the 7 commands of the 7 superlative intellects of the 7-headed serpent god called Narayana. Churchward said that the Nakal flourished on Moo between roughly 50,000 years ago all the way up to 12,000 years ago. He described them as being a melanated or black race that was superior in many regards to our own. So I suppose that's why the white supremacists haven't glommed onto this one, eh? Churchward said that at the time of its destruction, 12,000 years ago, Moo had 64 million inhabitants, 7 major cities, and colonies on other continents. The 64 million inhabitants were divided into 10 tribes, and in spite of being distinctive tribes, they all followed the same government and the same religion, which makes me wonder how they were distinctive tribes. Churchward definitively placed Moo in the Pacific Ocean, and claimed that islands such as the Marianas, Easter Island, called by the natives Rapa Nui, and Hawaii are the remnants of Moo. This would have made the continent 5,000 miles east to west, and 3,000 miles north to south, or considerably larger than South America. According to Churchward, the creation myth of Moo ran thusly. Moo had been raised from the ocean by volcanic activity. The same volcanic activity that created Moo would also turn out to be its downfall, however, as due to volcanic eruptions and earthquakes caused by the same, eventually the entire continent was completely obliterated in almost a single night, and the broken land fell into a great abyss of fire and was covered by 50 millions of square miles of water. Now, if you're wondering how a continent larger than South America could disappear in one night, Churchward has an answer for you. He said that the continent was made primarily of granite that was honeycombed with large caves and caverns. These caverns were filled with explosive gases, which were ignited by the volcanic activity. The explosions would then go on to ignite other caverns, and so on and so forth. Once the explosions had emptied the chambers of their gases, there was nothing to keep the continent from collapsing in upon itself and crumbling beneath the waves. Just as Ignatius Donnelly had done for Atlantis, James Churchward claimed that all great civilizations, Egypt, Greece, Central America, India, Burma, Easter Island, and especially the ones with a penchant for megalithic architecture, all had their common origin in Moo. He supported his claims by pointing out similar symbols and themes from all across the world. Themes such as birds, and the relationship between the earth and the sky, and the sun. So, multiple cultures from around the world acknowledged birds and the sky? Well, I'm convinced. Churchward claimed that one of the kings of Moo was called Ra, which is of course the name of the ancient Egyptian sun deity, except for a brief time in the Amarna period when the Egyptian pantheon was gotten rid of in favor of a monotheistic sun disk god called the Aten. The Rapa Nui word for sun is Ra-A, so Churchward drew a connection there as well. Churchward also undertook his own translations of the Bible, and from these he was able to determine that Moses had certainly been educated by the Nakal Brotherhood in Egypt, and that the Garden of Eden was most definitely in the Pacific Ocean. He also managed to tie pretty much every Polynesian monument to Moo in one way or another. Churchward's writings were accepted by the Theosophical Society and their ilk, although not by Madame Blavatsky because she was long since dead by the time Moo had begun publishing, but by everybody else they were thought of as complete nonsense. Quite rightly so. Now, the placement of the continent of Moo in the Pacific has oftentimes caused it to become conflated with another lost Victorian continent. Yes, there's another one. The Victorians loved inventing continents. Enter the land of Lemuria. For many years, scientists were puzzled by the presence of the same species, especially lemurs, in the south of India and on Madagascar, but not in Arabia and continental Africa. In 1864, zoologist Philip Schlater proposed an answer to this quandary: the land of Lemuria. Lemuria was supposed to have been a continent that once connected Madagascar and the south of India, but was now sunken beneath the Indian Ocean. Now, in a time before continental drift was understood, this would certainly account for lemurs being found in India and Madagascar, but not in between. This theory was widely accepted by the scientific establishment, and for the next 100-odd years, it was taught in schools until it was overtaken by the theory of continental drift. In fact, in some Indian states, it stayed in textbooks well into the 1980s. I was telling my boyfriend's mother, who was born in Madras in 1965, about this video, and she said, "Oh yes, I learned about Lemuria in school." The reasons for India holding on to Lemuria for longer than the rest of the world will be discussed anon. First, we've got to get through some more craziness. In 1870, the biologist Ernst Haeckel suggested that perhaps Lemuria was the ancestral homeland of humanity. This theory was seized upon by, guess who? Yes, your favorite occultist babushka, Madame Blavatsky, who wrote that Lemuria was the original home of a human race, whom she creatively called Lemurians. In 1904, William Scott Elliott wrote a book called The Last Lemuria, in which he made some truly cracked claims that tie this whole thing together. He described Lemurians as being 15 feet tall. They had brown skin, flat faces, a prominent jaw, no forehead, and bird-like sideways vision. He said that they could walk backwards and forwards with equal ease, reproduced by laying eggs, and were capable of interbreeding with other animal species. It was this interbreeding that eventually led to the ape-like human ancestors. He further said that after Lemuria was destroyed, the surviving ape-like creatures went to, guess where? Drumroll, Atlantis! Yes, Atlantis, of course! Went to Atlantis, and they became the forebears of the various races of Atlantis. And as far as I can tell, he is the first one to break up the Atlanteans into various different races. Donnelly and Plato broke them up into different tribes, but this is the first mention I've found of there being different races. It is all fictional, so it does not really matter. But he classified those Atlantean races thusly. First came a black-skinned people called the Remoahal, I think. Remoahal. These people eventually became a copper-colored people called the Tlavatli. The Tlavatli were ancestor worshippers, and can you guess who they became? Write your guesses down below. They became the Toltecs. It really is all, like, it's all coming together. Yeah, so the Tlavatli became the Toltecs from the last video, who again were real people. This is the first people to have been mentioned who were real. They did not come from Atlantis. If you want a brief history of the Toltecs, see my last video. Scott Elliott said that the Toltecs had advanced technologies such as airships. The Toltecs were said to have been succeeded by the first Turanians. The Turanid race is supposed to be like a subset of the Caucasian race. The first Turanians were then succeeded by the original Semites, basically Middle Eastern people, and they would go on to create other sub-races like the Akkadians and the Mongolians. Now, all of this is, of course, a lot of pseudoscientific hot air, having absolutely no basis in reality, but Scott Elliott is not done, and therefore neither are we. He claimed that 100,000 years ago, a group of Akkadians moved to Britain where they built Stonehenge. Scott Elliott, who seems to have been something of an iconoclast, claimed that, quote, "The rude simplicity of Stonehenge was intended to protest against the extravagant ornament and over-decoration of the existing temples in Atlantis, where the debased worship of their own images was being carried on by the inhabitants." I would love to hear his thoughts on the Catholic or Eastern Orthodox churches. Scott Elliott also took it upon himself to add to the lore of the destruction of Atlantis. He claimed that it initially split into two distinct islands called Daitya and Ruta. Eventually, Daitya and most of Ruta disappeared, leaving only a small island called Poseidonus, or Poseidonus, probably Poseidonus, which also eventually disappeared. Now, all of this nonsense ties into the Abbé de Bourbourg's theory that the Mayans were descended from the Toltec people. But Scott Elliott was far from being the only person to speculate about where the Lemurians may have gone after the destruction of Lemuria. In 1905, an occultist writer named Frederick Spence Oliver wrote a book called A Dweller on Two Planets. In this book, he rejected the theory that the lost Lemurians had gone to Atlantis, and instead decided that they had taken up residence underneath Mount Shasta on the border between California and Oregon, where they lived in a jewel-encrusted city called Telos and wandered around wearing white robes. Others claimed that the surviving Lemurians took up residence in the sea and eventually turned into whales, dolphins, and mermaids. Victorian mermaid video, anyone? Let me know in the comments. Now, I hasten to add that when Lemuria was being taught in schools, it was not being taught with all of this conspiratorial nonsense. It was being presented as what it had originally been intended to be, an explanation for why there are lemur skeletons in the south of India and on Madagascar. Now, do you remember what I said earlier about how some South Indian states held on to Lemuria well into the 1980s? Well, now we're going to talk about that, because it's quite interesting. They hung on to it because it squares very nicely with Tamil legends of a sunken land called Kumari Kandam, which are first mentioned in Tamil writings of the 15th century. Because of this connection, some Tamil nationalists have adopted Lemuria as a symbol of cultural pride, describing it as the cradle of Tamil civilization. In 1981, when the theory of continental drift was pretty widely accepted, the Tamil Nadu government launched an unsuccessful study to try to square Lemuria with the theory of continental drift. While there is evidence of some sunken lands in the Indian Ocean, such as Zealandia, Mauritia, and the Kerguelen Plateau, none of them is of an adequate size to have spanned South India and Madagascar. In spite of this, though, Lemuria still shows up from time to time on Tamil maps, although it's unclear to me whether or not this is supposed to be like a spiritual depiction or if it is intended to be scientific. Although I hasten to add, because I know people will take this and run with it, a majority of South Indians do not believe in Lemuria now. Now, the line between Lemuria and Moo is quite wobbly, especially today. They're oftentimes conflated. However, I'm going to be judging them as separate entities. Moo was not widely believed in the 19th century. It was believed by the Theosophical Society and a couple of cranks and crackpots, but for the most part, I mean, you heard how crazy that all was. Of course, most people didn't believe in that. Most people hadn't even heard of it, I'm sure. So yes, with the exception of Madame Blavatsky and her Theosophical Society, most people saw it for the nonsense that it was, and I am in agreement with most 19th century people on this point. But Lemuria is quite a different story. Although the bizarre theories concerning Atlantis and Mount Shasta and mermaids were certainly not believed, the general concept of Lemuria was accepted by the scientific establishment for a century. Indeed, it almost feels wrong to refer to Lemuria as a conspiracy theory. It was a scientific hypothesis that was later disproven. And under that logic, one would have to call all disproven scientific hypotheses conspiracy theories, and I don't think that's fair. So, given that it was accepted science at the time, it's safe to say a majority of people did know about and believe in it. In fact, Donnelly uses it in this book as scientific evidence for how a continent can sink beneath the waves. So yes, it was widely accepted and believed. This is certainly the most believed conspiracy theory. Again, conspiracy theory is, I'm hesitant to use that word to describe it because it was so believed and accepted by science. I do not believe in it because we know about continental drift now, but at the time, yeah, it was accepted. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know if you want a mermaid video down below or if there are any other theories you want me to talk about. I've got some recommendations underneath some of my other videos that I'm going to look into. Until I see you again, I hope that you are doing well. Thank you so much to the people who support this channel on Patreon. I could not do this without you. I hope you all have a wonderful and blessed day. Bye-bye. Moo is sometimes called the Atlantis of the Therefore, it stood to reason that therefore it stood to reason